Amelia Hart shoved through the heavy gold-trimmed doors of the Crestwood Hotel's rooftop gala, her rain-soaked hair plastered to her neck and her borrowed heels clicking unevenly on the gleaming marble floor, each step a reminder of the downpour that had ambushed her on the frantic dash from the subway to this opulent world where she was utterly out of place. She wasn't supposed to be here, not among the glittering chandeliers and velvet-draped tables, but her best friend Nora, who was catering the event, had called her in a panic after Amelia's interview at a small publishing house imploded in a blur of fumbled answers and a dismissive editor who barely glanced at her portfolio. "Come for 5 minutes," Nora had pleaded over the phone, her voice bright but insistent. "You need to breathe. There's music, there's wine. No one will know you don't belong." Amelia had relented, planning to hide in a corner, maybe swipe a canapé, and slip out before anyone noticed the damp thrift store dress clinging to her frame under Nora's too large coat. But the moment she stepped inside, the live jazz band's warm, swinging melody wrapped around her like a lifeline. The saxophone wailed, the drums pulsed, and her feet twitched with an urge to move, to shed the weight of the day's failure in the rhythm. But the crowd, women in flowing gowns, men in tailored tuxedos, swirled across the polished dance floor, with an ease that screamed wealth and belonging, making her feel like an intruder. Her sneakers, tucked into her bag because she hadn't trusted her heels in the rain, seemed to mock her as she shifted awkwardly, the squeak of wet soles barely audible over the music. She was about to turn back, to flee into the storm rather than face this gilded cage, when her gaze landed on him. Ethan Caldwell, though she didn't know his name yet, standing alone by the floor-to-ceiling glass doors that opened onto the balcony, his broad shoulders framed by a black suit that hugged him too perfectly to be anything but bespoke. His tie hung loose, his jaw sharp under the soft glow of the chandeliers. But it was his eyes that stopped her dead. Stormy grey, fixed on the dance floor, with a quiet, almost melancholy yearning that mirrored the ache in her own chest. He wasn't scanning the room for status or connections. He was watching the dancers as if he longed to join them but couldn't bring himself to cross that invisible line. Amelia's heart thudded, loud enough to drown out the band, and before her brain could scream that this was a terrible idea, she was moving toward him, weaving through the crowd with a purpose she didn't fully understand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "Would you dance with me?" He turned, startled, his gaze locking onto hers, and for a heartbeat she was sure he'd brush her off or laugh at the audacity of this rain-drenched stranger in a wrinkled dress. Instead, he studied her, taking in her flushed cheeks, the damp curls escaping her messy bun, and the defiant spark in her brown eyes that dared him to say no. "I know it's strange," she rushed on, words tumbling out. "You don't know me. But I need to dance tonight, just one song. I swear I won't talk your ear off or step on your toes." His lips curved into a soft smile, not mocking but warm, like he saw something in her worth trusting. "One song," he said, his voice low and steady. "I can manage that." His hand was warm when she took it, solid in a way that anchored her racing pulse, and he led her to the dance floor as the band shifted to a slower, smoother tune, a ballad that seemed to hum with possibility. "I'm Amelia," she said, trying to keep her tone light as his hand settled gently on her waist, the other still wrapped around hers. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before saying, "Ethan," his voice catching slightly, like he wasn't used to offering his name so freely. They moved together, her steps tentative at first, his confident but not flashy, and the world around them faded until it was just the music, the soft press of his palm, and the way his eyes held hers like she was the only person in the room. "You don't seem like a regular here," she said, half teasing, testing the waters, and his mouth twitched in something close to a grin. "Not exactly," he replied, his gaze lingering on her a little too long, warm and searching. The song ended, but neither of them let go, their hands still entwined as the band transitioned to another melody. "Another?" he asked, his voice rougher now, like he was afraid she'd pull away. She nodded, her cheeks flushing, and 2 more songs passed in a haze of shared glances, quiet laughter, and a growing ease that felt dangerously natural. When they finally stepped off the floor, breathless and a little dazed, Ethan led her to the balcony, where the city sprawled below in a glittering mosaic, rain misting the air around them. "Let me guess," she said, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the chill. "You're a tech mogul, or maybe secret royalty hiding out at fancy galas." He let out a low, genuine laugh, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the hum. "Of the crowd. Mr. Caldwell, the investors are ready." Amelia froze, her heart lurching. "Mr. Caldwell?" she said, turning to him, her voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened just slightly, a flicker of tension crossing his face. "That's me," he said quietly. Her stomach plummeted as the pieces clicked into place. "As in Ethan Caldwell. Caldwell Innovations, private jets, Forbes list. Ethan Caldwell." He nodded, his expression unreadable, like he was bracing for her reaction. "Yeah." She took a step back, the chasm between their worlds yawning wide and unforgiving. "I just asked a billionaire to dance," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Her mind reeling. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his eyes softening. "You didn't know, I liked that." The sincerity in his voice only made it worse, made her feel exposed, like she'd stumbled into a story she wasn't meant to be part of. "I should go," she said, already backing toward the elevator, the rain-soaked hem of her dress dragging as she turned. "Amelia, wait!" He started, but she was already moving, fleeing into the storm outside, the scent of her lavender shampoo lingering in the air behind her. Ethan stood rooted, watching her vanish through the doors, a strange ache settling in his chest, and in that moment, he knew he couldn't let her slip away so easily. By Monday, Amelia Hart had shoved the memory of the Crestwood Gala into a mental box labeled unreal and buried it beneath the weight of her immediate worries: rent due in 10 days, a savings account that could barely cover a week's groceries, and 3 freelance pitches rejected in a single morning, each email colder than the last. She sat cross-legged on her sagging couch, chewing a pen cap and glaring at a blank Word document, the cursor blinking like a taunt when her phone buzzed with Nora's name flashing on the screen. "Get to the Nook now," Nora said, her voice sharp, with excitement cutting through Amelia's fog of self-doubt. "I'm working," Amelia lied, her eyes still fixed on the laptop, but Nora wasn't having it. "You're not working. You're sulking, and someone's here asking for you." Amelia's stomach flipped, a mix of dread and curiosity pulling her off the couch, her worn sneakers hitting the floor as she grabbed her jacket. The Nook was a cozy coffee shop tucked between a second-hand bookstore and a florist, its warm lights and cinnamon-scented air a haven where Amelia often scribbled in her notebook when her tiny apartment felt like a cage. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, the bell jingling softly, and the smell of roasted beans and fresh pastries enveloped her. Nora was behind the counter, her eyes wide, mouthing, "Oh my God," as she clutched a coffee pot mid-pour. Amelia's gaze swept the room, landing on Ethan Caldwell seated at a corner table, his presence jarring in the unpretentious space. He wore a dark sweater and tailored jeans, his sleeves pushed up to reveal strong forearms, but the watch on his wrist, sleek, understated and probably worth more than her rent, betrayed his world. He stood when he saw her, his grey eyes softening, and Amelia felt her pulse quicken, a mix of embarrassment and something warmer she didn't want to name. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said, sliding his hands into his pockets, his posture open, but cautious. "I should have told you who I was at the gala." Amelia crossed her arms, glancing at Nora, who was now pretending to wipe the counter, but clearly eavesdropping. "You didn't owe me anything," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was just a dance." Ethan shook his head, stepping closer, his expression earnest. "It wasn't just a dance. I went back looking for you. I left the investors' meeting. Early went downstairs, but you were gone." Her heart thudded loud enough she was sure he could hear it. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan gestured to the chair across from him, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "I don't go to those events to meet people anymore," he said, settling back into his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm there for business, for show, but you walked up to me like you didn't care who I was, like you weren't trying to get anything from me. You just wanted to dance." Amelia swallowed, her throat tight, unsure how to respond to the intensity in his gaze. "I'm not good at this," he admitted, leaning forward, his voice softer now, Normal conversation, not deals or strategies, just honesty. "But I want to try with you." She studied him, the faint lines around his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted slightly, betraying a nervousness she hadn't expected from someone who commanded boardrooms. "You're doing okay," she said quietly, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. He gave a small laugh, almost self-conscious, then grew serious. "I don't want to scare you off, but I'd like to see you again." Amelia's fingers tightened on the table, her mind racing. "You want to date me?" she asked, blunt because she didn't know how else to be. "I want to get to know you," Ethan said, his voice steady but warm. "And maybe that leads somewhere." She stared at him, the weight of his words settling over her. "You don't think we're from different worlds?" she asked, her voice low, testing him. "I think we are," he admitted. "But I also think I haven't stopped thinking about you since you walked away." A silence stretched between them, not awkward but heavy with possibility. Amelia's mind churned. Her life was a mess of overdue bills and rejection letters, while his was private jets and headlines. Yet here he was, sitting in her favorite coffee shop, looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd never dared ask. "What makes you think I'm not just another girl after a rich guy?" she said, half challenging, half curious. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "You walked away. That told me everything." She leaned back, her defenses cracking under the weight of his sincerity. "If I said no?" she asked, testing him again. "I'd respect it," he said, "but I'd regret not trying." Amelia exhaled, her resolve wavering. "All right," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "One coffee. That's it." Ethan's smile was different this time. Not amused, just warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "One coffee," he agreed. They stayed at that table for nearly 2 hours, the world outside fading as they talked. He asked about her writing, not the surface-level questions people tossed out at parties, but real ones, about the stories she loved as a kid, the way she felt when a sentence finally clicked, the quiet joy of a perfect metaphor. She found herself answering without the usual filter, her words spilling out unpolished but true. She learned he'd grown up in a small Boston apartment, that he'd coded his first app at 16, that he hated the taste of champagne despite owning cases of it. When she admitted her latest rejection had left her questioning whether she'd ever make it as a writer, he listened without offering platitudes, just nodded and said, "You'll get there, I can tell." The sky outside turned orange, and Amelia glanced at her phone, startled by the time. "I should go," she said, standing, her heart heavier than when she'd arrived. Ethan rose too. "Can I walk you?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Outside, the city air was crisp, the streets alive with the hum of evening traffic. They walked side by side, not touching, the silence between them comfortable but charged. "Why me?" she asked finally, stopping under a street lamp, her breath visible, in the cool air. Ethan stopped too, his eyes searching hers. "Because you're the only person I've met in years who didn't look at me like I was a transaction." Amelia's chest tightened, her fear of being swept into his world warring with the pull of his honesty. "I'm not good at this either," she said, her voice barely audible. "Dating someone like you, it's a lot." He nodded, not pushing, just waiting. She looked up at him, something shifting inside her. "Okay," she said, the word feeling like a leap. "Let's see where this goes." Ethan's hand brushed hers, not taking it, but close enough to feel the warmth. And in that moment, Amelia knew she was stepping into something bigger than she'd ever imagined. Amelia Hart stood on the stoop of her run-down apartment building, clutching a worn canvas bag, her breath catching as a sleek, slate-grey Bentley purred at the curb, its driver in a crisp black suit stepping forward with a polite nod that made her feel like she'd stumbled into someone else's life. Ethan Caldwell had invited her to dinner, a gesture that felt both thrilling and terrifying after their coffee at the Nook, and though he'd said "come as you are," her faded jeans and thrift store cardigan now seemed woefully inadequate as she slid into the car's leather interior, the scent of citrus and polish overwhelming her senses. The drive wound out of the city, past neon-lit streets and into a quiet stretch of tree-lined roads, until they pulled up to a glass-and-stone estate nestled against a shimmering lake, its modern lines and glowing windows looking like something torn from an architectural magazine. Amelia's stomach knotted as she stepped out, her sneakers silent on the gravel, and there was Ethan, waiting at the entrance, no jacket, sleeves rolled up, his grey eyes lighting up with something unguarded. Relief. Maybe when he saw her. "You came," he said, his voice warm, and she managed a shaky smile, replying, "You sent a spaceship." His quiet laugh eased her nerves, but as they walked inside, the sheer scale of the place, marble floors, steel accents, a chandelier that looked like a constellation, made her feel small, like she was trespassing in a world that could swallow her whole. Ethan led her to a dining area where candles flickered on a table set with heavy silverware. A chef plating roasted duck and glazed carrots as soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers. And Amelia sat, hyper-aware of her every movement, her fingers. Brushing the stem of a wine glass she was too nervous to lift. "This is a lot," she admitted, her voice low, and Ethan nodded, settling across from her, his expression earnest. "I didn't bring you here to impress you," he said. "I brought you here to feed you. You said you hadn't had a proper meal in days." The memory of her offhand comment at the Nook, tossed out between sips of coffee, made her chest tighten. He'd listened, really listened, and that small act of care chipped away at her defenses. Over dinner, Ethan opened up, his voice steady but raw, telling her about his childhood in a cramped Boston apartment where the lights flickered if the microwave ran, and his mother, a single parent who worked double shifts, taught him to dream, bigger than their circumstances. "She passed a few years ago," he said, his gaze dropping to his plate, "cancer, before I could give her the life she deserved." Amelia's throat tightened, her own losses, her father's absence, her mother's, long hours at a diner, echoing in the space between them. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, her hand twitching as if to reach for his but staying put. He looked up, a faint smile breaking through. "She'd have liked you, said you're too stubborn to quit." Amelia laughed, the sound surprising her, and asked about his early days, learning how he'd nearly lost everything when his first startup tanked, how he still carried the first rejection letter from a venture firm in his wallet. "It keeps me grounded," he said, wiping his hands on a linen napkin. "Reminds me not to get too comfortable." She nodded, understanding the weight of rejection too well, her own stack of no's piling up with every pitch. After dinner, Ethan led her through glass doors to a private dock stretching over the lake, the night air cool against her skin, the water reflecting a sky dusted with stars. "You bring all your dates here?" she asked, half teasing, her sneakers scuffing the wooden planks. "I don't date," he said, leaning against the railing, his voice quiet but firm. "Too many people want something. Status, access, a headline. It's not the same with you." Amelia's heart thudded, her guard wavering. "You think I'm different?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "I know you are," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her look away, swallowing hard. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable but charged, heavy with unspoken questions. "I don't know what you expect from me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anything to offer you." Ethan stepped closer, not touching but close enough she could feel the warmth of him. "You offered me your honesty," he said. "That's more than most." She looked up, seeing the hardened edge in his eyes, the way he held himself like he was always braced for betrayal, yet his voice softened when he spoke to her. "I'm not trying to own you, Amelia," he added. "I just want to know you, and if I don't fit in your world, I'll make space." Her chest ached, the sincerity in his words clashing with her fear of losing herself in his orbit. "I don't trust." "Easy," she said, her voice raw. "Neither do I," he replied, and something in his tone, vulnerable, unguarded, made her take a step closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy and warm. "If I fall into this," she said, her eyes locked on his, "I fall hard." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, and I'm sure that's what I want." The air between them crackled, and before she could overthink it, Amelia leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was neither slow nor careful, but desperate, like they'd both been holding their breath since the gala. His hands slid to her jaw, gentle but firm, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that mirrored her own, and the dock creaked beneath them as the world spun too fast to notice. When they pulled apart, breathless, Amelia's heart pounded, her voice a whisper. "Okay," she said, the word a promise. "Okay," Ethan echoed, his forehead resting against hers for a moment, his breath warm on her skin. She nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Let's see where this goes," she said, and as they stood there, the lake lapping softly below, Amelia felt the weight of her fears lighten, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, their worlds could meet. The night stretched on, the stars brighter now, and though she didn't know what lay ahead, she knew she wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet, not from him. Amelia Hart stood at the edge of a rooftop garden, her fingers curled around the stem of a champagne flute she hadn't sipped, the city's twilight glow shimmering below as the soft hum of conversation swirled around her at a charity gala she'd never imagined attending, let alone on Ethan Caldwell's arm. The navy silk gown she wore, chosen herself from a boutique Ethan had quietly arranged, hugged her frame in a way that made her feel not like an imposter, but like a version of herself she was just beginning to trust. Confident, grounded, unafraid, to meet the eyes of the elite crowd milling about with their practiced smiles and understated wealth. Ethan was a few feet away, deep in conversation with a museum director about a restoration project he was funding. His posture relaxed but attentive, and what struck Amelia most was his trust in her independence. He didn't hover, didn't check if she was okay, and that quiet faith made her chest ache with a warmth she hadn't expected. She was still adjusting to the shift in their relationship, the way their kiss on the dock had cracked open something raw and real, when a voice to her left sliced through the crowd's murmur. "You're not what I expected." Amelia turned to find a woman tall and poised, her sharp bob and sharper eyes framed by jewelry so subtle it screamed old money, her gaze assessing but not unkind. "I'm sorry?" Amelia said, keeping her tone neutral, her fingers tightening slightly on her glass. The woman tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I've known Ethan a long time," she said, "and I've never seen him bring someone to one of these." Amelia took a measured sip of champagne, buying time. "That's his choice," she said, her voice steady. The woman's smile deepened, almost approving. "Exactly, which is why you're interesting, not clawing your way into this world, just standing in it." Amelia tilted her head, unsure if it was a compliment or a test. "Is that a good thing?" she asked, and the woman's eyes glinted. "It's rare," she said, then drifted back into the crowd with a polite nod, leaving Amelia to exhale a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan appeared moments later, his hand brushing lightly at her back, his voice low. "Everything all right?" Amelia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Perfect," she said, though she added, "Your friend gave me the 'who are you really' once over." Ethan's eyes followed the woman's retreating figure, a wry smile crossing his face. "Clara measures everyone, but she's not the one I care about impressing." His words, simple and direct, sent a warmth spreading through her, and she looked up at him, her voice softening. "You don't have to keep proving anything to me." He met her gaze, his expression serious. I'm proving it to myself, that I can let someone in." The weight of his admission hung between them, and Amelia felt the pull of his world, not as a threat but as a space he was trying to share. Later, as the gala wound down, they slipped away early, the city's lights blurring past the tinted windows of Ethan's car. Amelia kicked off her heels, tucking her legs beneath her, and turned to face him, the intimacy of the moment loosening her tongue. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The galas, the masks, the constant performance?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. "It's exhausting," he admitted, "but it protects the people I care about. My team, my board, they need me to be unshakable." Amelia reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his. "And what about me? Which version do I get?" He glanced at her, his gaze softening. "The real one," he said. "The one who doesn't have all the answers, who sometimes wonders if any of this means anything." Her heart squeezed, and she squeezed his hand in return. "You don't have to wonder that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't respond right away, but his thumb traced a slow circle over her knuckles, a silent promise. The car pulled into his building's underground garage, but instead of heading to his penthouse, he said, "There's something. I want to show you." They rode the elevator to the top floor, then climbed a narrow staircase to a heavy glass door. Ethan pushed it open, stepping aside, and Amelia stepped onto a small, quiet rooftop, not the grand garden of the gala, but a private retreat with a long bench, a few potted olive trees, and a telescope pointed at the sky. The city's noise felt distant here, the air cool and still, and Amelia's breath caught at the simplicity of it. "I built this when I bought the place," Ethan said, joining her, his voice low. "It's the only place I can breathe." She walked to the telescope, peering through it to see faint stars piercing the city's glow, and murmured, "It's beautiful." Ethan stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "I come here when the world down there gets too loud, when I need to remember I'm small." The vulnerability in his words made her turn to him, her heart full. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said, her voice soft. "I wanted you to see the part of my life no one else does," he said, his eyes searching hers. Amelia stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan's gaze held hers, steady and sure. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to do it alone." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat steady, under her cheek, and his arms wrapped around her, warm and grounding. They stood there, the city sprawling below, the stars faint but present, and Amelia felt something settle inside her, a certainty that despite their different worlds, they were building something real, something worth fighting for. The moment, stretched, quiet and perfect, and though she knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, she wasn't afraid, not with Ethan beside her, sharing the parts of himself he'd long kept hidden. Amelia Hart stood on a small stage in a packed bookstore, her heart hammering against her ribs as she faced a sea of faces, her debut novel stacked in neat piles around the room, a banner with her name in bold letters swaying gently behind her. The air smelled of paper and coffee, and the crowd, strangers, friends, and a few curious locals, watched her with quiet expectation. But it was the weight of her own dreams, finally tangible after years of rejection, that made her hands tremble. As she gripped the pages of her manuscript, she'd spent months pouring her soul into this book, countless nights hunched over her laptop, wrestling with words that refused to cooperate. And now, here she was, reading aloud sentences she'd once thought would never see light. Her voice started shaky, but as she spoke, the story took over, about a woman finding her place in a world that felt too big, too unyielding, and the room seemed to lean in, caught in the rhythm of her words. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that washed over her, leaving her breathless. But her eyes sought only one face. Ethan Caldwell's, in the back, dressed down in a hoodie and jeans, his grey eyes shining with a pride so fierce it made her chest ache. He didn't clap, didn't need to. His smile, wide and unguarded, said everything, like she'd hung the moon just by standing there. The crowd milled about after, some asking for signatures, others offering kind words, but Amelia felt the world narrow to a pinpoint when Ethan waited until the room emptied, approaching her with a quiet intensity that still caught her off guard. "You did it," he said, his voice low, and she nodded, her throat tight. "I did," she said, then added, "but not alone." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small square box, and Amelia's breath caught, her heart stuttering as he opened it to reveal a ring, not ostentatious, but simple, elegant, with a single sapphire that caught the bookstore's soft light. "I know this is fast," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with a vulnerability she'd come to recognize, "but I've learned not to let time decide what matters. You walked into my life like lightning, loud, unexpected, impossible to ignore, and I want to build something with you, quiet mornings, late nights, all of it." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "Will you marry me?" Amelia's throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, not from doubt but from the overwhelming certainty that this man, who'd seen her at her rawest and still chose her, was her home. She didn't hesitate, didn't need to. "Yes," she said, her voice clear, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into his arms as the bookstore's quiet hum faded, leaving only the warmth of his embrace and the steady beat of his heart. Months later, their wedding unfolded not in a grand cathedral or a rented mansion, but in a rustic orchard tucked in a valley, its ivy-covered stone walls and rows of apple trees glowing golden in the late afternoon sun. Amelia had been adamant. No, press, no spectacle, just them and the people who mattered, a guest list barely topping 40. If I can't laugh in my dress or dance barefoot by the end of the night, she'd told Ethan one morning, sprawled on their apartment floor amid fabric, swatches and handwritten invitations, it's not the wedding I want. He'd kissed her forehead and said, then we'll do it your way. Her dress was soft silk, flowing and light, with tiny white blooms woven into her loose curls, and she wore no heels, her toes curling into the cool grass as she stood at the edge of the orchard's stone path. Nora, adjusting a delicate strap on her shoulder, whispered, "You sure about this?" with a teasing grin, and Amelia's smile was unwavering. "I've never been more sure," she said. The chapel doors opened, a small wooden structure that smelled of lavender and old oak, and the music, a single violin, slow and soulful, began. Ethan stood at the front, his charcoal suit simple, his eyes locked on hers with a quiet awe that made her breath catch. No smile, just a look so full of love it anchored her. As she walked toward him, the world blurred. Nora's soft sniffle, the rustle of leaves, the warm light filtering through the trees, until it was just him, waiting for her. Their vows were handwritten, hers speaking of how he'd taught her to be brave without losing her softness, his recounting the night she asked him to dance, and how every choice since had been about choosing her. When the officiant asked if she'd take him as her husband, her I do was steady, unwavering. His was the same, his voice low but certain, his eyes never leaving hers. No one clapped when it was over, just a reverent silence as the guests stood, the kind of quiet that settles when something rare unfolds. Later, under a canopy of string lights, Ethan led her to a makeshift dance floor in the orchard, the band playing a slow, old tune that echoed their first night. He pulled her close, his hands warm on her waist, and murmured, "You've ruined my ability to focus on anything else." She laughed, her head against his chest. "You weren't exactly focused before I showed up," she teased, and he chuckled, his breath warm against her temple. "True, but now I don't even try." They danced through one song, then another, the guests fading into the background, the night theirs alone. As the last lanterns flickered and the orchard grew quiet, they walked hand in hand to a small stone cottage they'd rented for the weekend, the door creaking as they stepped inside. Amelia kicked off her shoes, sinking onto a worn velvet couch by a crackling fireplace, and Ethan joined her, tugging off his tie with a contented sigh. "I didn't think I could have this," he said, his voice soft, this kind of joy, this peace. Amelia curled her legs beneath her, leaning into him. "You can," she said. "You do." In that moment, with the fire casting shadows on the walls and the orchard silent outside, Amelia knew they'd built something unbreakable, a life rooted not in grandeur, but in the quiet certainty of choosing each other, every day, no matter what lay ahead. The seasons turned quietly for Amelia Hart and Ethan Caldwell, their new life unfolding in a modest lakefront house they'd chosen together, its wooden floors and wide windows, a far cry from the sterile grandeur of Ethan's old penthouse, but filled with a warmth that felt like home. Winter draped the surrounding hills in soft snow, and they spent long weekends curled under thick blankets in the living room, a fire crackling as Amelia read manuscripts aloud, her voice weaving stories while Ethan listened, his laptop forgotten, on the coffee table. She'd taken on a small publishing imprint under Caldwell Innovations' creative wing, not as a favor, never that, but as a partner with full control, her name on the door, her vision shaping every book they chose to champion. Ethan, for his part, had stepped back from the relentless pace of his corporate life, handing day-to-day operations to a CEO he'd mentored, choosing instead to advise from afar, barefoot with a mug of coffee, Amelia's laughter drifting from the next room as she scribbled edits on a draft. Their home wasn't opulent, but it was theirs, with shelves already groaning under the weight of her books, and a sunroom where Ethan could work without the buzz of a boardroom, the lake outside, reflecting the changing sky. They celebrated small victories, her first starred review in a literary journal, a glowing paragraph that made her cry into Ethan's shoulder, his first full night of sleep without checking his phone, a milestone he hadn't realized he needed until she pointed it out with a teasing grin. The absence of galas, red carpets, and flashing cameras felt like a gift, their evenings now filled with dinners around a worn oak table, plates mismatched, laughter echoing off the walls as they argued over who burned the garlic bread. One summer evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, casting a golden haze over the lake, Amelia stood on the dock behind their house, her bare feet cool against the wood, Ethan's arm around her waist as they watched the water ripple under the fading light. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, and whispered, "This is the life I never knew I could want." Ethan kissed her hair, his voice soft. And it's only the beginning. Their days were built on intention, not excess, mornings spent with coffee and quiet conversation, afternoons where Amelia lost herself in her work, her fingers flying over the keyboard, while Ethan sketched ideas for a new tech initiative, one focused on literacy programs inspired by her passion. They'd learned each other's rhythms, the way she needed silence to write, the way he needed her voice to anchor him when his mind drifted to old pressures. One evening, as they sat on the porch, fireflies blinking in the dusk, Ethan pulled out a folded piece of paper, his expression hesitant. "I almost didn't show you this," he said, handing it to her. It was her query letter, the one she'd sent to a small press months ago, now marked with notes in an unfamiliar hand. "I sent it to our senior editorial director under a pseudonym," he said, watching her closely. "She doesn't know it's you. She called it the most honest manuscript she's read in years." Amelia's eyes stung, her fingers tracing the paper. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice thick. Ethan shook his head. "I know, but I believe in you. If the world doesn't see what I see, I'll help them look harder." She leaned forward, pressing her lips to his, and he pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping tightly around her, the lake a quiet witness to their shared dreams. "I love you," she whispered, and he murmured back, "I love you more." She laughed, resting her forehead against his. "That's impossible," she said, and he grinned. "Then we'll keep trying to prove each other wrong." Their life wasn't perfect. There were late nights when Amelia doubted her work, when rejection letters still stung, and moments when Ethan woke tense, old habits of control creeping in. But they faced them together, her hand in his, their arguments ending in quiet apologies and tighter embraces. Spring brought green shoots to the hills, birds nesting in the trees outside their bedroom window, and a sense of permanence that settled deep in Amelia's bones. They planted a small garden, laughing as they fumbled with seedlings, dirt smudged on their faces, and when the first tomatoes ripened, they ate them straight from the vine, juice dripping down their chins, the simplicity of it more precious than any gala's champagne. Ethan still carried his rejection letter in his wallet, a reminder of his roots, but now he carried something else too, a photo of them from their wedding, Amelia's smile wide, his eyes soft, a moment captured when they'd promised forever. Amelia, too, kept a memento, a napkin from the Nook, scribbled with a line she'd written during their first coffee, a reminder of the day she'd chosen to take a chance. Their kisses still felt like the first, hungry and full of wonder, each one a promise to keep choosing each other. One night, as they lay in bed, the windows open to let in the warm summer air, Amelia traced the lines of his hand, her voice soft. "Do you ever miss it? The big life, the spotlight?" Ethan turned to her, his eyes clear. "Not for a second," he said. "This, you, us, is what I was looking for all along." She smiled, her heart full, and nestled closer, the sound of crickets filling the silence. Their life was a tapestry of small moments, her reading to him under the shade of an apple tree, him surprising her with a new notebook when hers filled up, their quiet walks along the lake where words weren't needed. As they stood on the dock again months later, the stars brighter now without the city's glare, Ethan slipped his hand into hers. No press, no cameras, just the man who'd once stood alone on a rooftop and the woman who'd asked him to dance. Together they'd built a life not of wealth or status, but of love, intention, and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. Amelia looked out at the water, her voice a whisper. "We did it," she said, and Ethan squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "We're just getting started." The night stretched on, the lake reflecting the sky, and in that moment, they were infinite, their love a dance that would never end.